In 1993, Konami once again released two games in the series, and once again one of them was a remake of Devil's Castle Dracula, this time for the Sharp X68000. The game was simply titled Devil's Castle Dracula, and once again starred Shimon Belmondo. The game differed from the Super Famicom version in graphics and gameplay. Shimon is less skilled with a whip, and looks more like an updated version of his Famicom self. The game is also viciously difficult, though highly addictive. This version of Devil's Castle Dracula is considered the most canonical by Konami, though according to them you can swap in the Famicom version if you'd like. The game was never localized, as there has never been an American counterpart to the X68000. For the second game released in 1993, Konami did something that, surprisingly, it took them a long time to do: go into the future of the series. Except for Dracula's 2, The Accursed Seal, all of the games released thus far were either remakes of or prequels to Devil's Castle Dracula, with nothing having happened afterwards. This was changed with the release of Devil's Castle Dracula X, Rondo of Blood, which was released for the PC Engine Super CD-ROM, making it the first in the series to use optical disc technology. The game starred Richter Belmondo, a descendant of Shimon. In the game, Dracula returns and kidnaps Richter's fiancée, Annette Lenard, and her younger sister, Maria, as well as the various other women. Richter sets off to rescue the girls and destroy Dracula. The game featured improved gameplay, CD-quality music, voice samples, branching paths, and the ability to play as Maria Lenard once she's rescued. Devil's Castle Dracula X, Rondo of Blood was extremely well received, with many saying it was the best entry in the series yet. However, despite this, the game was not localized. The American equivalent of the PC Engine Super CD-ROM would have been the Turbo Duo, an add-on to the TurboGrafx 16, which was called the PC Engine in Japan. The system was not nearly as popular here as it was in Japan, which is possibly why they never localized the game. There was only one Dracula game released in 1994, and it's quite an interesting one. I have a lot to say about this. In 1994, Konami released Vampire Killer for the Mega Drive. The choice to go to the Mega Drive rather than the superior Super Famicom was made due to Nintendo's fairly strict censorship policies. Although Nintendo has largely given the Dracula series a lot of leeway in breaking their rules, such as no religious iconography in games, they still would not allow blood, which if you stop and think about it, really should be in such a horror-themed series. Occasionally, they would allow some blood in the Japanese releases, such as the Super Famicom version of Devil's Castle Dracula, which was changed to green slime or acid in the American release. Sega had no such restrictions, though, so Vampire Killer was released for that system. The game's story attempts to reconcile the series canon with that of the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker. The game is essentially a sequel to the book in which Dracula is resurrected by the Countess Bathory. In the game, you can play as either John Morris, the son of Quincy Morris from the book, who is distantly related to the Belmondo clan, or Eric Lecard, a spear-wielding warrior who may actually be related to Dracula, as some fans believe him to be a son of Alucard. Although the graphics and music were inferior to the previously released Super Famicom game, Vampire Killer is one of the best games out there for the Mega Drive, and a damn good entry in the series. I also find it interesting that years later, Bram Stoker's great-nephew, Dacre Stoker, would write a sequel to Dracula called Dracula the Undead. It also features the Countess Bathory and a son of a major character, Quincy Harker, the son of Jonathan Harker, who was named after Quincy, who in the games is the father of John Morris. Phew! The localization is also definitely worth noting. The game was released in America for the Genesis as CastleVania Bloodlines, but in Europe it was released as CastleVania The New Generation. Oddly enough, although Konami released a game for Sega to avoid censorship, the European version of the game is heavily censored, and they weren't even allowed to put the word blood in the title. Ironically, the sanitized European version could have easily been released for Super NES. The game itself is sort of typical of Mega Drive Konami releases. It's hard, with long stages and lots of bosses, kinda similar to Contra 4, the hardcore. The game is also the first in the series that lets you choose your character from the beginning, and the first to offer multiple endings based on the difficulty setting you choose. In the American version, the names are generally intact, though the Countess Bathory is called Bartley instead. In 1995, Konami would release Devil's Castle Dracula XX for the Super Famicom, essentially a remake of Devil's Castle Dracula X Rondo of Blood. The game was much smaller, much more linear, and censored to fall in line with Nintendo standards. You still played as Richter Belmondo, and could still rescue Annette and Maria, but the other girls were cut from the game, and you couldn't play as Maria. Many people consider Devil's Castle Dracula XX to be a butchered port, but others were just happy to have any version of the game, especially that this is the one that actually got localized. Like Vampire Killer, the game got two different localizations. In America, it's called CastleVania Dracula X, and in Europe, it's known as CastleVania Vampire's Kiss. There's really not much more to say about it, except that as the game eventually got yet another remake, it's no longer considered canon, if it ever was. 1997 had only one game released, though it was a big one, a sequel to Devil's Castle Dracula X Rondo of Blood, titled Devil's Castle Dracula X Nocturne in the Moonlight for the Sony PlayStation. The game actually starts with a recreation of the last boss battle from Rondo of Blood, and then gives you the story and intro. In the game, you play as Dracula's son, Alucard, and you can unlock Richter Belmondo also, though that was really just a bonus mode. The game has Alucard and a grown-up Maria both arriving at the castle to find that Richter Belmondo has become its lord. This turns out to be a ploy by Shaft, a dark priest who was a boss in Rondo of Blood, who in the end resurrects Dracula. The game has a non-linear Metroid style of gameplay, which led to people coining the term Metroidvania, or alternatively, Castletroid. It was hugely popular in Japan and is considered by many to be the best in the series, and has since often been imitated. The game was localized as Castlevania Symphony of the Night in America, where it wasn't nearly as popular, with many feeling that Castlevania should have gone 3D. Ironically, when the series did try out 3D, people didn't much like it, and suddenly this PlayStation gem got the attention it had always deserved. In 1998, Konami released Devil's Castle Dracula X Nocturne in the Moonlight again, this time for the Sega Saturn. The game was largely the same, but had some new features, such as 2 new areas to explore, new music, and the ability to play as Maria Leonard, and a few new items. You could also choose your character right at the start, much like Vampire Killer. However, as the Saturn was not as popular in America as it was in Japan, the Saturn version of the game never got localized. Also in 1998, Konami released another prequel, this time intending to be the very first game in the series chronologically, Devil's Castle Dracula Dark Knight Prelude. Dark Knight Prelude was released for the Game Boy, and had Super Game Boy support, used a modified version of the engine from The Legend of Dracula 1 and 2. In the game, you play as the first Belmondo warrior, Sonia. In the game, you learn that she's also in a romantic relationship with Alucard, and the ending has her having a baby, presumably his, and presumably Rafe C. Belmondo, which would make all Belmondo warriors after Sonia to actually be descendants of Dracula. Devil's Castle Dracula Dark Knight Prelude was released in America as Castlevania Legends. The game was well received, but it has since been stricken from the canon, as it did not fit in with the story of the rest of the games. Sonia would have appeared in another game alongside Victor Belmondo for the Dreamcast, but that was cancelled, so really it's almost as if she never existed at all.